Good morning. My name is Val McIntosh, and I'm a debate coach at the University of Michigan, and I am very excited to introduce our expert lecturer for this morning. This is Jonathan Blanks, who is a visiting fellow in criminal justice at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity and a contributing editor at the Clause 40 Foundation. For more than a decade, he has provided a unique voice on policing, the courts, the U.S. Constitution, and other criminal justice issues. Specifically, he has written about social and racial consequences of criminal justice policy in the United States, which, as I'm sure you all can put together, is a very close intersection with what we have been debating for the last 6 weeks. His work has been published in a number of popular media outlets, including the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Chicago Tribune, the New York Post, Philadelphia Inquirer, Reason, Democracy, A Journal of Ideas, Vice, and Vox.com, among many others. And he has testified before several deliberative and legislative bodies, including the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And he is a graduate of one of our fellow Big Ten universities, Indiana University. So I am going to turn it over to him to talk to you all about the dichotomy between policing reform and defunding the police, among other things. And then if you have questions, feel free to start throwing them in the Q&A as we go, and we will have time at the end to go through and have him answer some of your questions. So thank you again for joining us, and we're excited to hear what you're going to talk about.
Thanks so much, Val. Go Hoosiers. So yeah, basically, as you all are, I'm sure, aware, much of the public debate about what to do about police has come down to like whether we should defund it or if we should just reform it and what exactly that looks like. I think to start off, we need to look at the history of how policing developed in this country and just in the sort of the Anglo-American sphere, and why thinking of it as just like one entity is probably not the best way to go about it. So as you all know, you grew up in the United States. Police are everywhere. You know, you don't necessarily deal with them every day, but you see them on the street. If you're driving along, particularly if you like to speed a lot, you keep an eye out for them. And they are the most tangible, obvious piece of the state that you see. I mean, the government is large, and of course we have state governments and local governments and feds, but they are the personification of the state. And they have the ability, they have the legal ability to kill you. So, but you don't think of them that way generally if you're, say, a middle-class white person. But to a lot of people in this country, they seem to be an oppressive force, and they are not, they are not there to protect and serve that, we're all told when we're growing up, and that they're, officer friendly and all that sort of thing. So instead of thinking of police as this thing that we've always seen and we always were aware of and that we've just sort of taken for granted, they weren't always what we see them as today. So if you go way back into like the old English times, you had these shire reeves that, collected taxes for the crown, and were basically, they kept a certain amount of order within their small jurisdictions. That's where those shire reeves is where we get the word sheriff from. And so that's still why they're out in the county, and they're less like in the less urban areas. So they've developed this like sort of one strand of policing within the Anglo-American culture. But then you also have sort of the development of urban police forces, based on like Robert Peel out of London, and you see these like pop up in New York and in Boston and various other large cities in the early United States. And so you think about right now, there are roughly 18,000, it depends what numbers you look at and what you count as a law enforcement agency, but about 18,000 police departments, law enforcement agencies in the United States. About half of them have 10 or fewer sworn officers. So you've got, but then on like the high end, you have like the New York Police Department have 35,000 officers, right? So there's this like really diverse group of institutions, and we think of the police, well, that doesn't, obviously it's useful in the general sense, but not necessarily in what it is that they do on a daily basis. Those 18,000 police departments operate under different municipal, state, and federal laws. They have different institutional goals. Some, you have here in DC where I live, you've got like police for the FBI. they're not the FBI. They are police for the FBI. On your you might have law enforcement in your high schools, or you have police departments that are on college campuses. All of these different organizations do all these sort of different things, right? And so when we're starting to think about what police do, we always have to just sort of you just have a caveat that they're not all the same thing. And so the idea that we're going to have one simple answer for what to do is just, it's not reasonable. So if you think about how policing has developed in the United States, particularly in the rural South, and you'll hear this a lot from the defund crowd, that so much of our policing is based on slave patrols. And that's true. I mean, particularly, again, in the sort of the descendants of the Shire Reeves and the sheriffs, that's certainly what happened. If you look before the Civil War, they were on slave patrols. They would go up into the north and they would have posses that like go get fugitive slaves. They would check, slave passes for people who, for enslaved people who were moving about the country. After the war, they obviously became very integral in restoring and maintaining white supremacy after the fall of Reconstruction. They basically played both sides in like the history of lynching, for example. So a lot of the incidents of lynching were giant mobs that actually stormed jails. Now, sometimes the sheriff tried to keep them off. Sometimes they just went along with it. Obviously, throughout history, it just basically depended on the jurisdiction of the sheriff at the time. So the idea that American policing is based in racism is absolutely true. And in urban policing, it was less generally that explicit, but keep in mind, particularly in the early phases of urban policing, which I'll get into in a moment, any democratic institution is going to reflect, the assumptions and the biases of the general public. So if you have a racist society, as we did, and you could argue do, that's going to be reflected in the policing. And if you think about the early phases of urban policing, who you read, and I don't think that there is a sort of a definite hierarchy of what each of these eras are, but I think the phases I'm going to break down for you, I think are just easier ways to think about it. But certainly you have them called different things by different authors over time. So if you think of the earliest urban policing, you can think of it as like a political patronage era. So late 19th century, early 20th century New York, for example, it was rampant political corruption. It was, you think Tammany Hall and that sort of thing. Basically, policing was a jobs program for their constituents. And that's part of like how the ethnic Irish got to be so powerful and so common in New York City policing, and I think Boston as well, because it was political patronage. So they got those jobs because they were Democrats, and that's how they paid them off. So that was highly sensitive to democratic politics, and a small d Democrat. So basically, if your patron got voted out, you might lose your job. You protected you protected the people who you supported, and police were part of that political organization. It was sort of like a protection racket, like you would see in the mob, right? That era eventually gave way to what I would call the civil servant era. Basically, it was just a job. It's a government job. It's less directly tied to democratic politics, again, small d. It's more insulated from democratic control, the popular control, but there is still some connection there. You had very high levels of violence. This is where we get like the idea of the third degree. Basically, you get interrogated and you get beaten up and all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, you also had this is where the officer-friendly era came from, right? Like this one, my dad was a police officer in Indiana from 1958 to 1978. And so he walked the beat, and people in the neighborhood knew him. And, years later when we were walking around, people would say, "Hey, Paul, what's Officer Blanks, what's, going on?" And I'd be like, "Who's that?" He's like, "I don't know. It's people I knew on my beat," right? So that was sort of the peak ideal of what Americans think of as like the glory days of policing, right? And of course, this still also reflected the assumptions of white supremacy. There was more overt interpersonal racism. And if you listen to like old Stevie Wonder songs and that sort of stuff, you hear the N-word and various other, expressions of police being very, very like racist, not just as an institution, but personally. And then we've come into the most recent era, which I consider like the professionalization and the rule of law. Basically, there's no fixed date on these. These are just sort of ways to think about police. They're not hard and fast dates, and different cities and different parts of the country reacted differently and had different functions of these types of policing. But the professionalization and the rule of law era, you can start thinking about like the war in court, where you have the Miranda warning, where the cops have to tell you that you have the right to remain silent before they can interrogate you, that you have a right to a lawyer. Obviously, that's from Gideon P. Wainwright. All these sort of procedural protections that the court put in to make sure that criminal defendants have certain rights and they aren't abused by police officers. At the same time, the Supreme Court also became very tolerant of incidental violence by police officers incidental to their work, rather than beating someone up in interrogation, which is not allowed. If you see someone running out of a convenience store and you think they might have just robbed the place, you can beat them up and hurt them to try and arrest them, and that's okay, even if the police officer was wrong. So at one time you have like the raising of the bar for defendants' rights, but at the same time, the Supreme Court was also making police violence a lot more acceptable. They set certain limits, like you can't shoot guys in the back and that sort of stuff, but they became generally tolerant of that. In this professionalization era, you have officers that are much less likely to use overt racism. I'm not saying it never happens. Obviously, 18,000 police agencies, racism still obviously is relevant in this country. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but generally speaking, it's much less likely to be overt. You also have at the same time the rise of unions in politics and police unions in politics particularly. So this actually kind of flipped it. So right now it's sort of difficult. I mean, obviously with all the protests, things have changed a bit, but for the, police reform has been going on for quite some time, and we get incremental reforms and we fight and we fight and we fight and we get like little tidbits, right? And part of the reason why it's so hard to fight is the police unions. And what they've done is sort of flip it. So instead of having, democratic control of what police do, they have an overabundant influence on democratic politics. And so when you have an electoral system, as many of our cities do, where you elect prosecutors and you elect judges, and the police unions can spend money in those races, and they endorse. They elect mayors. Local politicians are very, very sensitive to what the police want and what the police union wants, because if you come out as anti-cop, that's going to be difficult. I mean, it's going to be harder to win. Every year, Gallup puts out this confidence in institution survey, and I'm very curious about what it's going to look like this year. But basically, every single year, the cops are right behind the military and small business as the most trusted institutions in the United States. Now, granted, when you break this down by race, it's going to change dramatically. White people are much more trust the cops much more than, say, Black Americans do. But as I was saying, it's like the cops have then become the power in democratic politics, which obviously is not something that you want in your public servants. At the same time, all this is all going on. We have the rise of the drug war starting in 1971. Obviously, you had drug enforcement before that, but Nixon's war on drugs. Whereas in the civil service era, you did have corruption. Obviously there were mob ties, particularly in your major cities, but most of the corruption was sort of looking the other way, like looking the other way on prostitution or gambling or drugs, whereas as the drug war heated up, particularly in the 80s and 90s, when police officers are much less likely to be corrupt. In the civil service area, it was just like, it was just more common. In the professionalization era, your basic cop on the street, you offer him $50 to get out of like an arrest, and he's going to tack on a charge. Like that's that rule of law, that like this idea that you don't see in every other country, right? There are certain countries where if your car gets stolen in Mexico, for example, like in Cancun or something along those lines, some police officers, you pay them off and they magically find your car. And I'm not, slagging Mexico in any way, shape, or form here. It's just that certain other countries don't have that same rule of law strength within their law enforcement. And there are a bunch of other social issues that go into that. But insofar as the American system, typically when cops get corrupt, it's for much more money. It's not just this sort of ticky-tack $50 stuff. And there's a great report that out of New York City in 1994 called the Mullen Commission that talks about how corruption manifested over the previous 20 years from this, what they called grass eaters, people who just like were on the take and just like looked the other way on prostitution, to these meat eaters that were basically running drug gangs out of the police department and, shaking people down, putting them at a gunpoint, just massive corruption squads within the department. At this also happening at this point, you have data-driven policing, the rise of CompStat. And what that did was it put an emphasis on on output, right? So if there's a spate in shootings, for example, every week New York City, for example, tracks how many homicides, how many shootings, how many robberies, and that sort of stuff. If there's an uptick in violence, the police can respond by showing, oh, okay, well, we made this many arrests or we recovered this many guns. And so it's become very incentive driven in that respect, where the cops reflexively can use these numbers to show what they're doing. And it's very much driven on arrests and seizures and that sort of thing, which is not exactly what we want in police. And I'll explain a little bit of that later. Ironically, though, at the same time as the rise of data in policing, there's been less transparency with the less democratic accountability, because again, they have the democratic power and we, the democracy, do not. The data that we want to get from police and like measuring police performance is much harder to get. So for example, up until 2015, I think it was, the best numbers that anyone in the country had for how many people cops kill in a year was 400. It was collected by the FBI. It was voluntary, and the information was voluntarily given by police departments, sent into the government, and they would publish it every year. So we assumed that there were around 400. Well, as crowdsourcing became available, and you can like send, you can tack a research team and do a bunch of searches through news clippings and that sort of stuff, we actually found out that American police kill roughly 1,000 people a year. They missed more bodies in the street that they created than they were telling us. And if they can't tell us something that basic, or they refuse to tell us something that basic, what do you think they're going to report about their use of force, whether or not it's necessary, whether or not it was justified? Disciplinary records are very difficult. One of the great things that have come out of these recent protests is the repeal of the Law 50A in New York State, which protected discipline records from public exposure. And so all of this is going on at the same time. We don't know, we basically just have to take police's word for it when they say something went wrong, or they say that, a particular shooting or use of force was justified. And it doesn't create a lot of trust. And if you're already in a situation where you have heavy police presence, and not just for tickets, but for you walking down the street and they shake you down asking if you have guns, and searching your car for drugs and all this stuff, and that's just part of their daily routine, the idea that they are a legitimate force for good is non-existent. So this is where we're at today. And so you have people who, I recently wrote a piece in Democracy Journal that sort of broke down the two camps, that there is like the defund people, the defund and abolish police, and then the reformers. And honestly, I think both sides offer a lot. I know you guys are a debate club, so I mean, debate group, so you're gonna have to pick one side, if not necessarily this, but it is really important to understand that while I'm kind of putting these at odds with one another, they both contribute a lot to what needs to happen and what's going to happen in the months to come. But backing up a second, if we think of the past few years and like the rise of Black Lives Matter, we think of certain flashpoints that I think are that tell us a lot about what is really going wrong with policing, and some sort of disturbing things to think about when we're talking about what we can do to fix things. So obviously you have the shooting of Mike Brown in Ferguson, and there were two reports that the Department of Justice put out. One was, basically everything we know about the shooting was legally justified. Whether or not it was necessary, they didn't come to a conclusion on. And I think that's always really important when you start thinking about police shootings. It's like, there's one thing is whether it's legal, but it's another thing entirely whether it was necessary. And I don't think it was at all necessary, but we can talk about that in Q&A if you want. But the second report is actually much more interesting from a policing perspective. So what they found was that Ferguson is a small community out in the suburbs of St. Louis. And basically it's one of these exurbs caused by white flight in the early 20th century. And so it is a community that really probably shouldn't exist. And there are a lot of cities like this and little towns that basically they don't have a reliable tax base. They should basically be part of St. Louis or like join these other suburbs into something else. But they have these small little groups. And what they did was they basically based their entire revenue model on taxing through policing. And so fines, fees, tickets, basically worked like, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was an absurd amount of the budget, maybe 2/3. And so you had this predatory policing that was going on in this town, basically just to keep the lights on. And that's absurd. That's not what police are for. Police are supposed to protect and serve, not pay for the city, right? And so, and of course, as most things in most institutions in American society, these had massive racial biases. So even though Black people only made up like a plurality of the town, they were the overwhelming majority of the people who were hit with these fines and fees. And some of these were just absolutely abusive. Like one guy was arrested for giving the wrong name. I think it was something along the lines of his name was Mike and he gave the name Mike and his name was Michael. Like it just absolutely ridiculous stuff. One guy got fined for, after he got beat up by the cops, they literally fined him to pay for the cleaning that he bled on their uniforms. I can't make this stuff up. Like absolutely abusive, inexcusable policing. And that was how they funded the city. And so the idea that you're going to find some justice in something like that is absolutely absurd. So it's just, this lends a lot of credence to the defund argument, right? But in you go a little bit further in the future, you have Eric Garner. Eric Garner, of course, was killed by a police officer in New York City with an illegal chokehold. It was already banned. Now, recently, New York State has criminalized that, but it was already against policy. And it took 5 years to get that officer fired. And the police union was very upset about it. And the thing is, he was being accosted because there was, at that time, there was, it wasn't the same level as Ferguson, but basically the cigarette taxes are so high in New York State that like some obscene number of their cigarettes are illegal, brought in from other states with lower tax rates, and so they're sold, on the black or gray market. And so, they had a directive to crack down on those. And I don't even know if he was in fact selling loosies that day. That's sort of the story around what happened, but that's why he was basically being stopped. But I'm not sure they actually found anything on it. But again, so it's this sort of revenue-based policing, which just doesn't make any sense for what we're actually trying, what we want, what we think of when we think of police, what we want the police to do. And then another case was back in Minnesota, where the most recent, the killing of George Floyd happened. You had the killing of Philando Castile. Philando Castile was shot and killed by a police officer during a traffic stop, and it was caught on video. The end of it was caught on video of his girlfriend that was put on Facebook Live, and it's really tragic, and it's like sticks with me. You see a lot of these sort of videos, but that one was one of the roughest. And the thing is like, yes, he was victimized that day. He was a legal concealed carry holder, and you sort of see the racial politics that are in part of the gun debate, because the NRA did not come to his defense or support his family after his killing. But he had been stopped, he was victimized that day so clearly. But he had been stopped 46 times, at least 46 times in the previous 13 years. And this sort of goes back to that policing in Ferguson, where they're just stopping him all the time. But there's no reason for that. He wasn't a terrible driver. He obviously wasn't a criminal, because he had a legal concealed carry permit. And if you have a felony, you can't have one, can't have any gun at all, let alone a concealed carry permit. And this is just, it's just patterns of abuse that we see over and over again that are directed at, and these are all black men. And my last example also is a black man. And it's absolutely essential to understand that this is, while most people aren't killed by cops, people are harassed by cops all the time. And black and brown people are face the brunt of it. So, of course, the officer that killed Castile was not convicted of the killing, and it's just one more in a litany of all these tragic stories. And so, but then we think of the Walter Scott shooting in South Carolina, where the officer actually was convicted of federal civil rights charges. For those who may not be aware of the story, Walter Scott was pulled over for, I don't know, it might have been a taillight or something. And he started running from the police officer, and he was shot in the back. He was shot and killed in the back, and the officer planted his taser next to his body. And this was all caught on cell phone video of someone who was not there. Before that cell phone video came out, it was basically probably going to be a justified shooting. In the officer's first trial, which was local, the jury hung on his, they couldn't convict. The man was shot in the back. No law allows this at all. He was unarmed. He was shot in the back. The guy placed a weapon by him to make it look like he was more dangerous than he was. And he was acquitted, which says something. Now, granted, it was only one juror that did this, but it says something about how our country views cops and how they view black people that implies something much darker than we're just not. It's just the laws that we need to fix, or it's that we need more accountability here or there. Like, these people, even those very few officers who are brought to justice, who are charged and tried for these crimes, sometimes they get off. And it's, sometimes it's because the laws, as I said, SCOTUS Supreme Court is very tolerant of police violence, but sometimes it's just because, well, I trust cops, and black people are scary. And that says so much more about our culture than it does about the police. And it is something that I think people really need to wrap their heads around when we start talking about what we need to do about cops. Because part of this, again, cops are popular. People, Americans tend to be very, they tend to be vengeful. Over the past 10 years or so, there's this movement against mass incarceration. And they're like, and so many people focus on nonviolent drug offenders. But what we're really but when it comes down to some crime that you hate, like particularly hate, like everyone's like, throw the book at them. And when it's just really important to understand that like we actually need to really rethink what we do with our justice system, what we're trying to do with our justice system, than just punish the people we really hate or did really really bad things and expect everything to work out well. So this is the milieu in which we're working. So you have the reformers of which I would call myself one, where we want to make, we want police to be more responsive to democratic control, to sort of rein in their power, basically, whether it's to defang the unions or if it's just to make sure that they are being more responsive to the communities that they're policing. We want more transparency and accountability. We want, more stuff like pulling down 50A and other legal protections that unions have put in the state laws that protect bad cops from any sort of accountability. The people who I would call reformers are across the traditional American political spectrum. They tend to skew liberal. I spent 12 years at a libertarian think tank. Liberals, libertarians, some conservatives, just want to make policing better. And there's actually what I really am super excited about as far as ways to make policing more effective are evidence-based policing. It's basically this new field of study that actually decides to apply science to policing techniques. Basically determining whether or not certain things that cops do make sense. So for example, many of you probably went through a DARE program, or at least it's not as ubiquitous as it was when I was growing up, but basically the cops come into schools and tell you all about the evils of doing drugs and, a lot of sort of stuff, which, yeah, you shouldn't do drugs. I get that. But like that they spent so much money on this for so many years. And this is how we're going to stop, kids from doing drugs. They're going to stop on the demand side. Evidence shows that DARE programs don't work. They just don't. They never have. It's like there may be a slight negative effect. Like DARE programs just don't work. And that's actually so emblematic of policing. Cops do what they think is supposed to be done. And again, when we set up the incentives, so, if they have to make their numbers on a certain week or, shootings go up, okay, well, we can turn in, we got to go find some guns. Okay, and then that shows that we're doing something. But it doesn't actually have any effect on what we actually want, which is a safer community. And so evidence-based policing actually is, PhDs, cops working together to actually try and make policing smarter and better and useful. Everything we want in cops to actually, like, does this actually drive down crime? Can we do this without, stomping on civil liberties? And it turns out there are things that cops can do, such as in a neighborhood that has recently experienced violence, visible cop cars. Like if you have cops there, just visible, they don't have to be shaking anyone down. They don't have to be asking anyone anything, just visible. It's much less likely that a crime recurs there in the next few weeks. We know this, and it's really basic stuff like that. Whereas because they are so incentivized to, show that they're doing something, so they'll stop a bunch of people and try to shake them down, ask them for try to search them for drugs and guns and whatever. That drives up resentment in the community, and people don't like it, and it repeats itself over and over again. But evidence-based policing, I think, is a way forward within the policing dynamic to actually make things better. The defunders and the abolitionists tend to skew much further to the left. There are some like libertarian anarchists who are definitely, abolish the police and borders and all that. But insofar as, and these are the people that, the conservatives are like really harping on right now in the culture war and like as the presidential election is approaching. because some of them are in fact Marxists, and they are socialist, very much in the sort of old Black Panther mold. They are the activists on the ground. They've been working towards this for a very long time. And, you know, while I am not a Marxist, they are good people and they are trying to make their communities better. They've created these, you know, these private institutions that are basically mutual aid societies to try and fill in the gaps that that society has failed for them. And what the defunders really want is to remove cops from social problems like overdoses and mental health crises and domestic violence, because, you know, these are all emblematic of other problems, and sending a sort of irate guy with a gun into that situation is not necessarily going to make it better. So one of the things that they're trying to put forward is like bring unarmed social workers and other experts to try and take care of these situations, so people having an episode like Laquan McDonald in Chicago aren't shot 16 times on the freeway, right? And that makes complete sense. But they have a broader social project that involves defunding the police and putting it towards these other goals, whether it's fixing poverty or education or healthcare, drug treatment. And I fundamentally support that, except that what we're about to see with COVID, you're going to see a bunch of municipal austerity. Tax revenues have plummeted, and they're going to continue to plummet. And while you may be able to get to defund some police, they are going to revert to these things that I was talking about earlier, in where it's still legal. You know, taxes, fines, and fees. Something I didn't talk about, but civil forfeiture. You know, using police to drive up revenue, and if it's their own revenue or whether it's the city, that's not good. And so while I support the fact that that, you know, these communities need more help than they're getting, I don't see it's going to be difficult to try and do that in a tax environment that is basically, the cities are stretched beyond their limits. You know, and obviously with the Republican Congress, the federal government isn't coming, a Republican Senate, federal help isn't coming anytime in the near future. And that's a problem. And the thing about this latest movement, where we've actually seen, like, the people in the streets are a much broader array of ethnic and racial diversity, and you're starting to see like polls come out that like 51% of white Americans think that there needs to be serious reform to police, which is obviously very large compared to past years. But of course, it's like 14% of Republicans. You know, it's great that their work has really finally shown much of the rest of the country what they've always known, which is policing is broken and violating their rights in their communities. But it's a pretty far stretch from like that to, oh, we need to cancel rent and all these other social issues that they want to happen. And again, a lot of them are like pretty reasonable, but it's probably not particularly likely in the coming municipal crisis. So that's like, those are the basic issues between the reform and defunders. Obviously, there's a lot more complicated. I'm happy to answer any questions about that or any other issues you have about questions you might have about you know, how policing operates, or other reforms and changes that you might want to see in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. I am going to ask, again, for students, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A on Zoom. And I'll start with one question that was asked in the chat, which was, why do you think sort of the more libertarian capitalist bent of sort of political advocates are particularly interested in criminal justice reform? And do you think that, you know, what do you think is kind of it seems like, and this is something that I think has been kind of true throughout a lot of the research we've done this year, that there is an intersection among people who are kind of on the left and people who are in the kind of libertarian-minded part of the center right, that kind of have are political bedfellows in this area, but not in a lot of other areas. And why do you think that is? Could you speak a little bit to that dichotomy and that area?
Sure. So, as I said, I spent 12 years at Cato as a libertarian think tank. They have been very proud of their being against the drug war for a long time now. Some of it is pretty simple, like, I mean, it's been oversimplified, like go to meetings at the Heritage Foundation, which is obviously very conservative Republicans, and they're basically like, you guys are Republicans who like to do drugs. And there's, there's definitely a group of people that is in fact their thing. But more seriously, that libertarians have cared about this for a long time, and they basically fear that they resent and fear the state, and the police are the most obvious and violent part of it, obviously outside of the military. And so they've long cared about these issues, but they have focused primarily on the drug war, and but also like vice crimes like sex work and that sort of thing. Whereas, but you also look at the population of libertarians. Now, like, I'm biracial, my father was Black, but most libertarians are middle-class white guys. And it's so they've always looked at it as sort of like, well, I'm in control of my body and the government shouldn't tell me what to do about it. And the fact that they're like spending all this money to stop me from getting high or stop other people from getting high is absolutely wrong and terrible. And they have been consistent fighting that for a while. At the same time, they have not been particularly good at understanding the racial dynamics within American policing and American society. And I spent years like kind of banging my head against the wall trying to get people to understand it, and they're started slowly doing it, and that's great. But it is too myopic to just focus on one part of the law, without thinking about actually how it operates in society. And so that's a major disconnect between the liberals and libertarians. But honestly, the libertarians were out in front of the Democratic Party by leaps and bounds on gay marriage and drug legalization and all that sort of stuff. But now that's like the policy folks. The people who like say fund libertarian organizations, they are invested in criminal justice reform for several reasons. One, there is a growing criminalization of, say, white collar crime, and this is something that a lot of liberal detractors and progressives are like, they only care about criminal justice reform because they're trying to get poison the environment and do all the things that businesses do that progressives really don't like. And I think there's a certain amount of truth to that in a limited scope. But I mean, the government has also used a lot of its successes in prosecuting people that should not be prosecuted criminally. If you want to find them, fine, that's great. But like, they have abused the law there. But some are more earnest than others. But yeah, that's definitely a tension that's been there for a long time. As far as like civil liberties are concerned, the libertarians are absolutely legitimate, but they don't, as I said, they don't really grok the racial aspects.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. And, even like in the research that I've been doing on the topic, I find myself seeing similar articles and similar arguments from people from a lot of like think tanks that are usually in very much opposition to one another, but kind of have similar ideas in this area. And so it makes sense to me that is kind of the clear intersection there. So another question from the students, how should we effectively deal with private policies in terms of private policing? So private, when there is, one of the most common responses to the argument that there is, defunding the police would result in, wealthier communities just hiring private policing, or reducing the scope of policing would just move that criminalization from a public realm to a private realm. Do you think that that's the case? Do you think that there are ways that we can formulate reform policies that would try to address or avoid some of the ways in which, to reforms could lead to the privatization of policing rather than, fully resolving the problems with criminal justice?
Yeah, so I mean, this is something I've been giving a lot of thought to, and it's one of the reasons why I am not like fully, full defunder, is because while like the people who are promoting defund the police, they have an entire like idea, like a new world that they want to build, and it's a nice one, and that is, it's great in theory, but I'm so afraid that if we really move away from having a neutral arbiter that is the state, that we're going to move to a situation where we have more Ahmaud Arbery's, we have more Trayvon Martin, where you're going to have people taking the law into their own hands because they're like, well, these are two like non-law enforcement officers acting in law enforcement capacity. And of course, if you have all the racial tensions that we've talked about, then that's just going to end up with more black bodies, and they're going to be acquitted by people who are like, oh, well, he's scary and he's black. So yes, I'm very fearful of something like that happening. Obviously, I don't really think that's where we're going in the immediate future, but yeah, that's why I'm sort of hesitant to do that, just because if you go back and you look at, say, the early 20th century, particularly in the South, you had a lot of wanton violence against black people that were done by like either paramilitary organizations, you have the Klan, you have all that sort of stuff. Like it's not outside of the realm of understanding that certain situations that could happen again. So you don't want that. Sense. So, but yeah, I mean, I just think leading on the evidence-based policing is really like, how can we actually make areas safer without requiring private security, or particularly privately armed security? Because it's like, basically, if you have a visible authority figure or a visible like security guard or something like that, crime is less likely to happen. And whether it's private or public, and so long as we're not encouraging and allowing and forgiving the abuse of power by people like that, then I think, whether it's a public or private sphere, it's fine. But it's just going to, I think it's really needed to finding the practices and whether it's privately or publicly funded solutions to the community problems, that, just really basic stuff that isn't all that complicated that we can do can make communities safer. But one of the things I talk about frequently is that, and this is something that I don't think libertarians have really grokked onto, that our society has already admitted that we're failing these communities, these poor black communities, because if you think about, and other people, not just black people, think of all the specialty courts that have developed over the past few years, drug courts, military veterans courts, mental health courts, all these different things where we're saying, okay, well, we're going to now get you the help that you need, but only after you got arrested, and we're going to threaten you with a cage if you don't comply in the way that we've set it up. Whether or not we've actually set you up for failure or success is another story altogether. Like this, we've already conceded that we're not doing doing enough for the people who are most likely to become criminal justice involved. And so it's a matter of like actually putting the resources, whether they're private or public or both, into making these communities better, so we don't have to worry about like vigilantes.
Yeah. So a sort of question that I think follows on to that question. To that is, do you think that that other types of public officials, social workers, things like that, can fill in to take over some of those roles from the police? Like, I know that's kind of one of the common proposals that people suggest. Do you think that what do you think that would look like? And do you think that is something that's feasible?
That will, and see, this is where given everything that's going on with COVID, it's going to be difficult to see how this transpires in sort of the short to medium term. If you do ride-alongs with cops, as I have, and I recommend when you can start being more social, I recommend anyone who's interested in this field to do this. Go on ride-alongs with cops in every area of the city that you live in, and you'll find that a lot of the calls that they get, a lot of the 911 before the proactive policing and any of that, they're domestic violence calls, and they are public disturbances or mental health calls that they're not necessarily trained for. And they hate these calls too. And that's like one like major area of agreement between like defunders and cops is like, we don't want to do this either, but because of the way municipal budgets have been built, the cops are the default because there's so many of them. And so again, this is part of the defund theory, which is, reasonable, that, take money away from cops and turn them into, give them to social workers. I don't know if we have an army of social workers that can respond to this many calls, frankly. I don't know if these cops if you have enough current police officers or potential police officers who want to just take on that role in a non-armed function. I am also fearful of, when cops do get shot, a lot of times it is because of a domestic violence call. I don't know what that looks like when the first unarmed, person gets shot. Are we just gonna be like, oh, scrap it, we're gonna go back to the way it is? And so I'm hopeful that we can get fewer armed confrontations, and whether or not that's police officers that aren't armed or specialist police officers or non-police officers, that's fine. But it's just a matter of trying to come up with the money to pay for those people, because social work is already an overly taxed system, and we don't have enough. It doesn't seem like we have enough for those who aren't directly criminally involved, and to get an army of them, I shouldn't use that term, but have so many of them out on the streets it's going to be a stretch for municipal budgets, and I just don't see the money for it right now.
So do you think that it would make more sense perhaps in the short term to invest in training police to better approach those situations than trying to necessarily in the short term shift who is responding to those? Or
I think with 18,000 departments, you're gonna I think it's this time for this is really a great time for experimenting and to do pilot programs to figure out what is the best way to do this, and to work with people who are already in the field in social work. Be like, okay, so what do you do? I know here in DC, social workers, particularly on Friday and Saturday nights, do ride-alongs with cops to try and diffuse situations and help them deal with these situations. So I don't know if it's more funding or if it's just, but definitely we need to change the way we train cops. I did this thing called the Citizen Engagement Academy, and I didn't go through the academy, just sort of it's basically a PR move for the cops to oh, this is how we do our jobs and all that sort of stuff. But they train cops to be fearful now. And the thing is if you look at the law and how they use force, that those things go hand in hand. If the cop can, if after an officer involved shooting, if an officer can say that he legitimately feared for his life or feared for the safety of others, he can use force. And whether or not that person had a gun or not, or they were walking through a Walmart with a BB gun, or they had a shower handle in their hands or whatever, that provides them legal immunity. And so what we have is we have a training regimen that trains cops to be fearful. They show them videos of cops getting shot. It's appalling, really. I mean, yes, these things do happen, but we've trained cops to be fearful and to dominate situations, to take control, and that's not always the best way to handle any particular situation. So yes, we need to be better about, whether it's de-escalation, although we're still trying to develop, the evidence-based community is actually trying to develop data to see, does de-escalation work? What does de-escalation mean? All that sort of stuff. But finding better ways for cops to address these issues, obviously, and to only use force when it's absolutely necessary instead of just because they are legally able to do so.
That actually, brings up a question I kind of wanted to ask what you thought about the debate over reforming or eliminating qualified immunity as a solution to, or not a solution, but part of a multifaceted solution to reducing instances where police use unnecessary force. Do you think that affects enough cases that it would make a meaningful difference? Do you think it would actually change how police, act on a daily basis?
I think there probably needs to be a suite of reforms to make cops more accountable for the violence they use. I think qualified immunity is a big part of that. My former colleagues at Cato have been very, very active in that role, in trying to get qualified immunity and getting broad-based coalitions to fight qualified immunity. But the thing is not everyone has the wherewithal to file a federal case. and maybe this could be, maybe there would be, a civil lawyers could work on, basically on the expectation that they'll get something if they win. But again, you're still working in a situation where cops are given the benefit of the doubt even when they shoot someone in the back on video. Like, it's really difficult in this environment. So yes, I support qualified immunity reforms, but other things that have been put out there are like making officers carry, liability insurance, just like doctors and lawyers have to take. So if they screw up, that they have to actually pay for it. Then they have insurance, so it's not really coming out of their pocket. It's just something they pay for. And when you become uninsurable, you can't be a cop anymore. Awesome. But we also just have to, and this is sort of a contradictory thing where we want for cops to be good at their jobs, we need to trust them. They have to have legitimacy and they have to have the public trust, but we can't always just take their word for it all the time. Like, it's like, because, how many cases get, forgetting violence for a moment, just, it's a cop's word against, a criminal defendant. So, they have terms for it called test-a-lying, like cops lie all the time. And it's like, how do we make cops, both more trustworthy, but also we can be more skeptical of them when we're in court. So I think it has to be a suite of reforms to make cops more accountable, including, say, lowering the standard. Right now, the federal standard for a criminal case for deprivation of civil rights has to be willful. So basically, if you accidentally shoot a guy, you're not going to be brought up on federal charges if you're a cop and you accidentally shoot a guy, you're not going to be brought up on federal civil rights charges. If, however, like a case that was just out of Baltimore a couple of years ago, officers shot a robbery suspect who was armed, and that part of the shooting was fine, but then the officer went up to him and shot him again after he was like down. Like, that guy got convicted of civil rights abuses. But every time there were all these shootings that were in the news the past few years, they're like, oh, and now the DOJ is investigating. I'm like, why? I know that there's no chance that they're going to file a federal case against it. So lowering that standard to like negligent, I think would also help. So you just need to be able to have cops feel that they will actually face consequences for their actions. And sometimes that's going to be administrative. But the thing is, the administrative system has failed largely because of the union protections that they built into it. Whether it's, no transparency in the investigation process and disciplinary findings, whether they can quit and keep their certification and go to another place, like the guy who shot, oh, sorry, I'm forgetting his name, which is terrible, but the kid in Cleveland.
Tamir Rice.
Yes, thank you. That was just a terrible circumstance where the guy was about to get bounced out of his department for being bad with firearms, and so he was allowed to quit and then go to Cleveland. They didn't check his records. They didn't even call the last department, and so he got put on the street and just shot a kid. And but the thing is like I talked to police, like former cops, and they were like, maybe he should have been fired, maybe he should have been fired, but the guy who drove up and the way that he drove up and approached Tamir, the driver of that car should have been fired. They were more mad at that guy because they're like, they put that officer in an untenable situation, and so he had to shoot. And I'm just like, did he have to lie about it first? And that part just apparently never hits. But anyway, but yeah, it's really about making them more liable for what they do and facing consequences.
Do you think that a policy reforms that would condition meeting a certain threshold for training or reporting requirements would be an effective approach? So putting certain injunctions on different police departments based on if they're not meeting certain reporting requirements for their things like use of force or things like that. Do you think that those would be effective? And do you think that they can be conditional, or do you think that those reforms have to be permanent?
I mean, I suppose it depends, like what the mechanism for enforcing it, right? Like, constitutionally, there's only so much that the federal government can do. Like, I mean, there is an argument that you can use like the guarantee of the Republican form of government clause to actually impose like sanctions on departments, or if you have certifications. again, I don't have like, if I wish I had like some sort of like grand strategy for like how to build these things, but it seems to me that if you increase democratic accountability for these departments, where like the actual populace wants the reforms to change, that would be good. Part of it would be reporting federally, but again, so much when we focus so much on stats, you know, cops, there have been exposés, particularly in New York, where officers, you know, will degrade the quality of, like, someone is like terribly attacked, and you know it's like clearly a felony case, but like they don't want their felony crime rate to go up, so they'll like put it down to like simple battery or something along those lines. So anything that's like based just on stats, I'm a little skeptical of, or at least not skeptical, but um, you can't put too much into it. You have to have like sort of just a comprehensive accountability reform, whether it's, you know, holding back federal grant money, whether it's you know, some sort of like public declaration, like maybe triggers some sort of you know, investigation, like the consent decrees or something along those lines. But the thing is like the DOJ just doesn't have that kind of, you know, they don't have that kind of manpower for 18,000 police departments. And again, a lot of these departments are very, very small. So you're talking about 5 sworn officers or something like that. So it's going to be very difficult outside of the municipal situations to even like govern these, which is just like sort of starting to understand like the scope of the problem when you're just like, oh, yeah, a county sheriff has like 5 officers and it's all a good old boy system, and the sheriff's elected and it's cooked. It's like, what do we do about this? It really has to do with like a public information campaign about understanding like what police are doing in your name and trying to get people to change that.
Another question that was asked was about the sort of police reaction to defunding or to even other reforms that, you know, the idea of police backlashing to those reforms, but using things like forfeiture to maintain resources. How can we write policies that, you know, make those reforms kind of stick and kind of reduce the loopholes or ability for the police to circumvent those types of reforms?
If you can, excuse me, if you can banish civil forfeiture, do it. If you can't, put it in the general fund so it doesn't go to the cops, so they're not policing for themselves. But also like a state fund, not like a municipal one, because again, Ferguson, something like that could happen. As far as like just a general backlash, you know, I think if we actually see what would do a whole lot of good would be stepping up the prosecutions of so many officers that misbehaved and were just wantonly violent during the protests, right? I mean, there's this really great Twitter account, this Greg Doucette. He is a lawyer out of North Carolina, and he's chronicled over 800 cases of wanton like violence just during the protests. They've made the best defund argument an abolished police argument I've ever seen, just by their behavior and their complete acting with impunity throughout all this. So to make sure that it sticks, I mean, it's like you just have to increase accountability. Sometimes it's accountability at the ballot box, sometimes it's accountability for individual officers. But as far as like crafting policy, yeah, get rid of forfeiture, make sure it gets out of the general, put it in the general fund, and basically put caps on fines and fees. So like you can't suspend someone's license for not being able to pay for some fine that has nothing to do with how well they're driving. Like you can suspend licenses if they're like driving drunk or something along those lines. But you know, you can't suspend a license for being poor, because then you're making it harder for them to actually make the money to, you know, pay off their fines and survive. So so those sorts of things, which are not directly like related to policing, but take all the incentives out that make cops do these things. I think a lot of cops really want to do the right thing, but if you tell them to get a promotion that you have to write X amount of tickets or you have to make this amount of citations or something like that, that's what they're going to do. You put them in a gun recovery unit, they're going to recover guns. And so you start trying to align the community's interests with the police interests. And I think there's more there than I think a lot of people understand, which is again why I'm like more reform than defund. But I think, you know, the defund argument is also a very strong one insofar as like we know we have these gaps in our society that we need to fill, and the cops aren't probably the best people to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm gonna ask a couple more questions, and I think we will have gotten through most of them then. So one, I'm going to kind of, combine a couple of questions into one, but what do you think is the ideal role of the police that is described in both a defund or reform vision? And do you think that there is alignment between what both of those groups want the police to look like? And what would you say the biggest differences are between what the ideal vision from reformers versus defunders is for what the role of the police looks like in the world of their proposals?
So I think everyone wants community safety. Like, that's the bottom line. People want safe communities. They, cops want to go home at the end of the night. They don't want any trouble. They just they want to do their thing. And so, yeah, that's like the easy part. But we've never really created an environment to measure that accurately. We have it we have crime rate, but again, we've incentivized the cops to create numbers instead of actually driving down the crime rate. And evidence-based policing shows that visible cops and certain other programs that you can use that are not invasive of civil liberties and creating all the antipathy that has led to thousands of people in the streets risking maiming and tear gassing and all that. They have a legitimate point. And that you can actually, do policing in a positive way to actually make people safer. And there are success stories that, have been documented, but, and that's a problem with the hardcore defunders. I saw a woman on was at a protest yesterday. I don't remember what city she was in, but she was just policing are illegitimate all across the world. It's an illegitimate institution and that sort of stuff. And so the idea of having police in a community for people like that is sort of a non-starter. I don't think most people are on that train, frankly. As in, police are very popular. Now, granted, sometimes they're not as popular in the communities that have to deal with them the most, but at the same time, there are still calls for service in those communities. That means someone's calling them. And if, we still live in a segregated society, and so it just follows that the people calling the police on these young Black kids are other Black people. And so that means that people do want the cops there because they fear for what's going on outside. So if you make those communities safer, and sometimes that will involve the cops, but it doesn't mean the cop has to be in your face all the time. And I think it's really trying to get but the thing is, cops are very, just as a practical matter, cops are very slow to understand evidence-based policing. It's a very small field right now. It's a bunch of ex-cops are doing it. Arizona State's got a really good program. George Mason here, just across the river in Virginia, has a really good program that's really doing this. But I went to an evidence-based policing conference at George Mason, and there was a guy wearing a DARE t-shirt. First thing, everyone at evidence-based policing knows DARE doesn't work, and this guy is wearing this to an evidence-based policing conference. You're so changing how you're going to do something beyond DARE, actually going out in the streets and where cops feel like they're hated and they're in danger, they're risking their lives. We really need to say, no, you really need to stop harassing people. This is going to work out. You just need to chill out, be visible, but don't be harassing, and interdict when people need you. But outside of that, you really need to hang back. And then there's also other problem-oriented policing, if there's an open air drug market or something like that, instead of arresting everyone, you can just take away certain things that enable gunfire to happen. So for example, there was I think it was in Cincinnati, where there was a drug house, and there would be shootouts on the street over and over again. And the thing is there were a bunch of cars on these streets that none of them were residents' cars, and they were basically gun stashes for people to hold their guns. And so if there was a shootout outside of the drug house, they would shoot. So they went out and they said, okay, we're gonna make it. They went and talked to all the neighbors, and they're like, okay, is this your car? Is this your? They're like, no, none of these are our cars. And so they put up a non-parking, a no parking zone there, and shootings went away. And then they were able to pair that with an investigation that actually ended the drug house and made the community much safer. That's that sort of the abolitionists aren't going to want that. And obviously I don't think drugs should be, as a nominal libertarians, like, I don't think drugs should be illegal, but at the same time, these are criminal networks that are they're causing violence and disruption, so that there is a legitimate role to disrupt those.
So last question that we had was, why do you think the police themselves struggle to see the racial disparities in the criminal justice system, and what types of interventions or policies do you think would be effective at helping police kind of understand the racial nature of the criminal justice system and the way that policing is racialized in how it in its impacts?
That's a very complicated question. I think basically it's the same problem that libertarians have, and I think it's the same problem that Americans have. We have never come to terms with how we've dealt with race in this country. Straight up, it affects all of our institutions. It affects like housing policy. It affects our educational system. It affects our policing. Everything is racially infused. So it's not just the cops. It's how do we change our society in a way that like recognizes and fixes these problems. I don't believe in bias training. Like the evidence isn't there, like the implicit bias stuff. It doesn't seem to work. And the thing is, it's like what I've seen besides that sort of thing, which is just like sort of throwing a term out there and like, oh, well, you know, people can be racist, but like, if that doesn't necessarily affect how you go out when you're unnaturally afraid of a black person or something like that, you're still going to react the way you're going to react. It's like you can know it, but you don't really feel it, right? So bias training isn't really going to be useful there. But like there has to also be better education about what people are measuring and what people like me are trying to do with the information that we're trying to get from the police officers and actually trying to get that information. So for example, in 2016, DC City Council passed this thing called the NEAR Act. And basically this was making the cops record how many people they stop and frisk. This is the most basic way I can put it. And the cops drug their feet, didn't want to do it. Finally were forced by a federal judge to comply. And then they still like, they lied about the law in the general order and made the cops do things that are not actually part of the law. And I was doing a bunch of ride-alongs when this was finally being implemented, and the cops were all joking, like, "Oh yeah, this is going to work. Yeah, this guy's going to tell me his gender identity." Like, and the thing is, that's actually not what they're trying to measure. What we're trying to measure is what the biases of the police officers, who they're stopping, on their own perception. They don't need to ask this what someone's gender identity is. And the thing is, but I'm doing ride-alongs with cops that are in these all-black neighborhoods, and they're saying they're going to get measured on who they're stopping. Well, they're like, well, I'm in this neighborhood. 97% of the people who live here are black. They're going to think I'm a racist cop, and they haven't explained to them like what it is that we're measuring. Of course, most of the people you stop are going to be black, but it doesn't like, are you stopping them for good reasons? Are you stopping them because they actually fit the description, or they just the only descriptor was they were black? And so there's just like a complete communication breakdown about what it is that we're trying to do. And the cops just want to do their own thing because they've always done it that way. And that's just sort of the habit that they're doing, and not actually understanding, like, okay, we have this purpose that we're trying to do. We're trying to make you guys better. You're trying to make you guys safer. You're trying to make, you know, fair, because we don't think you're all bad. But if you like systemically stop it, this is the union. This is leadership. This is like the people who are out here talking about community policing and what they're trying to do. And at the same time, they're mistreating their own officers because they're not giving them the full understanding of what it is that that the researchers want. And if you can't do something that basic, like, you know, trying to explain to them like, well, yeah, Thomas Jefferson was a racist and our country was based on racist principles. It's like, you know, that's a stretch, right? So it's less about really trying to reform how cops think about how racialized what they're doing is like understanding, like, are they actually making the community better? And because like I when I testified in Arkansas, it's adjacent to the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights, this a local one. I was describing like cops are being asked to go out and do this stuff, and they're doing it in these neighborhoods, and of course it has a disparate racial impact. And the guy actually invited me. He's like, well, isn't that institutional racism? And I was like, well, yes, it is institutional racism, but I don't use that term because cops get freaked out about it. And it's trying to make cops like better, like, you know, progressive, you know, people isn't the way to go about it. You really just have to incentivize them to do the right thing, and you don't have to necessarily put it in the best terms of, what we actually are trying to do with them, but actually just saying, hey, the community resents this. Maybe we're asking you to do the wrong thing, and we're just trying to measure that. And we're not going to like judge you for it. And please just be honest and do what we ask. And I think that's going to go a lot further than just saying, oh, you're part of this giant racist organization, and you're racist and you're terrible. And unfortunately, I think too many cops feel that way. And I understand like how it sounds to them, but it's a reflection of our society, and I think people need to like sort of come to terms with that it really is not just the cops. It's America, and what we do with our police and our democracy is going to be reflected back to us in our institutions.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like one of the biggest problems is that people only see contingent instances of racism as actual racism and while they may recognize that there are some structural problems, they don't see themselves as participating in those structural problems even when they are. And that seems like one of the big problems with policing. Okay, well, that is all of our questions. And thank you so much for giving us your time. I think the kids got a lot out of this. I definitely got a lot out of this and really enjoyed it. So thank you again so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Good luck, everybody.
Thank you.